Ever find yourself looking at a community study or a survey, the kind with like maybe 30 or 40 people,
Mm.
and you just think, how can they really say anything about the bigger picture from just this?
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. It's like, how many interviews or how representative does something local have to be before we can actually believe it applies more broadly?
It really makes you wonder, right? Like, how do researchers studying complex social issues, how do they take these smaller scale studies and actually make findings that, tell us something beyond just those specific people or places?
It's a huge question. It gets right to the heart of how we even think about knowledge in the social sciences, especially the qualitative side.
And that is exactly what we are diving into today.
Oh, perfect.
We have this really fascinating article by Mario Lewis Mall, who's a sociologist at the University of Chicago.
Okay.
The article is titled, How Many Cases Do I Need? On Science and the Logic of Case Selection in Field-Based Research.
I love that title.
It's a great title. And Small really digs into this core question for qualitative researchers, especially for folks doing ethnography or in-depth interviews in fields like urban poverty, immigration, the kinds of studies that we talk about a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so important to think about this, especially because, as Small points out, this kind of qualitative work, often with tons of really rich details, is often read and assessed by researchers coming from a more quantitative background, people like demographers or economists,
Right.
and they often have a totally different idea of what makes evidence strong or compelling.
Right. So you've got this kind of inherent tension, right? On the one hand, you have the classic quantitative approach, which is all about getting a big representative sample to make statistically generalizable claims about a whole population.
Right.
But then on the other hand, is it even fair? Or does it even make sense to hold this really in-depth qualitative research to those same standards? Can we really expect a small number of carefully chosen cases to tell us something meaningful about, the broader picture? That's the big puzzle Small is tackling, and it has huge implications for how we even understand and value this whole category of social science.
Absolutely. And one way Small gets at this is through this really interesting analogy.
Okay, tell me about it.
So he brings up this concept of cargo cult science.
Oh, interesting.
It actually comes from a commencement speech by the physicist Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner.
Yes, I remember that one.
It was back in '74 at Caltech, and it's just such a fascinating speech.
Yeah. Remind us, though, about these cargo cults he talked about.
Right. So during World War II in the South Pacific, all these islanders saw airplanes landing, full of all kinds of goods and supplies.
Yeah,
And of course, when the war ended, those planes stopped coming.
makes sense.
But the islanders, they really wanted those goods to come back.
Right.
So they started building these incredibly detailed replicas of runways. They'd even light fires on the sides to look like landing lights.
Wow.
Yeah, some even build wooden towers that looked exactly like, air traffic control towers. They were imitating everything they'd seen, but of course, no planes ever landed.
Because it was just the appearance, right? They had the
Mm.
form down, but
Exactly. They were missing the fundamental, like the core understanding of how those planes actually worked. And so Feynman uses this to explain what he calls cargo cult science. It's research that follows all the superficial procedures, looks like the real deal, but it's missing some key ingredient. And so the planes, the meaningful findings, the breakthroughs, they never actually show up.
I see, I see.
And Small takes that idea and connects it to qualitative research. He suggests that sometimes qualitative researchers, feeling the pressure to show their work matters on a broader scale, maybe to impress their quantitative colleagues, they can fall into a similar trap. They adopt this language, these forms of quantitative methods, throwing around terms like random or representative, but without actually getting the underlying logic right or truly achieving statistical generalizability.
So they are going through the motions.
Exactly. And it's like, Small takes Feynman's analogy even further, saying that some cargo cults actually built remarkably accurate replicas, like planes out of logs, sticks, leaves. They were almost perfect visually.
But they never fly.
Right. And the point is that simply trying to look like rigorous quantitative work doesn't make qualitative research generalizable in a statistical sense.
It's like putting a costume on a dog and calling it a horse.
Yeah.
It's still a dog.
Exactly. And Small argues that even though social science has definitely had its wins, it's super tempting for ethnographers today to just copy quantitative standards of evidence, especially with all the pressure they face in academia.
Right, right. So this leads us to think about the overall environment where this kind of ethnographic work is happening.
Yeah. So Small talks about how we're in this time where, at least in areas like urban poverty, social inequality, immigration, both quantitative and qualitative research are super active. And people in both camps are citing each other's work.
So it sounds like there's at least some respect across the divide.
To some extent, yes. Those really intense methodology wars of the past have cooled down. We do see more mixed method stuff now, and researchers are at least looking at what's happening on the other side. But Small points out that even with this seemingly more open environment, if you look at the top sociology journals or even broader social science journals, they're still dominated by quantitative research,
Mhm.
especially from sociologists, demographers, economists, that whole group.
Okay, so why do you think that is?
Well, a few reasons. One is just the sheer volume of large quantitative data sets available. Think about the US Census, the current population survey, all that.
Hmm.
These are massive collections of data on things like poverty, neighborhoods, you name it. It's just readily available for anyone to do these big statistical analyses.
So when you have those kinds of numbers, it's hard to argue, right?
Right. And then there's the whole funding landscape. Small says fields like poverty studies, immigration research, they get a decent amount of funding, but the big funders, the Russell Sage Foundation, the NSF, these kinds of groups, they've historically been more likely to support quantitative projects. And naturally, the books and collections that come out of those projects are going to lean heavily quantitative, even if they give a nod to ethnographic work.
It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess.
Yeah.
The more money goes to quantitative research, the more it gets produced and the more it dominates the field.
Yeah, and this creates some real challenges for the ethnographers working in these areas.
Well, what are some of the consequences of this kind of setup where quantitative work has so much more weight?
Well, Small points to two big ones. First, ethnographic studies in these fields often get evaluated methodologically by, you guessed it, quantitative researchers.
Right, because they're the ones reviewing the grants,
Yeah.
the articles.
Exactly. So you have someone whose bread and butter is statistical modeling, reviewing a deep dive into, say, 40 individuals in one particular community.
And they might know a lot about the topic, say urban poverty, but not much about how to do good ethnography.
Precisely. It's like asking a fish to climb a tree. Small talks about this happening to his own work. He did an ethnographic study of this mostly Puerto Rican housing complex in Boston called Villa Victoria.
Okay.
And it was reviewed for a sociology journal by a demographer. The review was mostly fair, but the methodological discussion got hung up on whether that one neighborhood was representative, which, of course, is a core idea in demography,
Right.
but maybe not so much in ethnography. The reviewer even said they were concerned about generalizability.
So it's like they're using a totally different yardstick to measure the work.
Exactly. And Small gives other examples, too. There's that famous study by Fordham and Ogbu on acting white among black students. Now, quantitative researchers are revisiting it, mainly focused on whether that small group of kids was statistically representative. But they kind of miss these bigger theoretical and structural questions that other qualitative folks have raised about that study.
So again, it's this focus on numbers that kind of takes over. What's the other consequence Small talks about?
Well, it's related. Ethnographic studies are often expected to represent larger things like poor neighborhoods as a whole, immigrant groups, etc., empirically, even though it's often super unclear how much that specific study actually tells us about the bigger picture.
This makes me think of that example Small uses about Clifford Geertz's famous work on those Balinese cockfights.
Right, that one. So when Geertz wrote about those cockfights in that one little village, no one really expected that exact same fight to play out the same way in every other village.
Yeah, that would be ridiculous.
The hope was that his theory, his ideas about how those games show societal power, that those might be insightful in other cultures. The empirical stuff from that one event wasn't supposed to be statistically representative.
It's about the bigger picture, not the literal cockfight, right?
Right. But Smalls argues it's different for ethnographers studying poverty or immigration today. People read a study of one poor black neighborhood and want to know, does this apply to all poor black neighborhoods everywhere? Same with those interview studies with like 40 people. Everyone wants to know if what they're saying applies to millions.
So the pressure is on to make the small stand in for the large.
Exactly. And that brings us to Small's big critique. This whole problem of trying to imitate quantitative methods to achieve this kind of generalizability.
Right, right. So what's the problem with doing that?
Small says a lot of ethnographers under this pressure end up mimicking quantitative stuff, especially when it comes to trying to show their work is representative.
And I'm guessing that isn't always a good thing.
Well, he says it leads to advice like, make sure your small sample is unbiased or that your case study is representative. But his big point is that this often means using the words of statistics without actually getting the logic behind them right.
So again, it's that cargo cult thing. It looks like the real deal, but it's not going to take off.
Exactly. He gives this hypothetical example of a student, Jane, doing interviews.
Okay, what's Jane up to?
She wants to look at how working-class African Americans feel about immigration for her second-year paper.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah. She's planning to do 35 in-depth interviews.
Okay.
And her advisor, wanting her to be scientific, suggests she tries to get a random sample from a phone book in a city with lots of working-class black folks.
Oh.
But of course, as anyone who's ever done this kind of research knows, the response rate is never close to 100%.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So even if things go really well, Jane ends up with only 35 interviews out of maybe 100 people contacted. But she might feel good thinking, hey, at least I tried for a random sample.
Right, it gives her study a veneer of legitimacy.
But Small says, hold on a second, let's look at this idea of generalizability in Jane's study.
Okay, let's break it down.
From a purely statistical point of view, her research has a couple of big problems. First, she's only interviewed those who were willing to talk to her. They might be different in some key ways from the ones who didn't. Maybe they had more time, maybe they're more opinionated, who knows?
Right.
And Jane has no information about those who didn't participate. So her 35 interviews, they might not really reflect the larger group she's trying to understand.
So it undermines the whole idea of a truly random sample from the get-go.
Exactly. And then there's the second issue. 35 people just isn't a big enough sample to say anything definitive about complex relationships in a whole population. Small says his students often ask him, how many people do I need to interview to be generalizable? And the short answer, he says, it depends. But if you want to look at all the subtle causes and effects of something in a big population, 35 just won't cut it. For that, you need a proper large survey.
I see. So how many people would Jane need in that case?
He gives some actual numbers, which is really helpful. If she wanted to know, say, what percentage of Black working class folks support some immigration policy, a yes-no question, to be 95% confident that she's within 5 percentage points of the true answer, she would need 385 people. And that's assuming the population she's interested in is 2 million. Even if she zoomed in on just one city, she'd still need about 280.
So way more than she got.
Way more. And Small's point is, calling something like Jane's study representative just because she tried for random sampling is using fancy statistical words without actually meeting the requirements. If she wanted to be statistically representative, she'd need a survey, not these in-depth interviews.
Right, and there's a trade-off there. You can't have both, can you?
Exactly. You can't have the depth of in-depth interviews and the statistical power of a large survey.
So if imitating quantitative random sampling doesn't work for these small sound studies, what does Small recommend researchers do?
He gives a couple of alternative qualitative approaches. One is sampling for range, where you first figure out the key subgroups in the people you're studying and then try to interview a set number from each group.
So for Jane, how might that have worked?
Say her initial interviews suggest people's feelings about immigration are different depending on whether they work in, say, manufacturing versus service jobs.
Okay.
Or maybe it depends on their parents' immigration history. So instead of just trying to randomly get 35 people, she could interview, 10 from each of those job types, and then also make sure she talks to people with different family backgrounds. This way, she can compare and contrast those subgroups directly, even if her total of 30 doesn't statistically represent all working-class Black people.
So it gives her a more nuanced view, even if it's not statistically representative. What's the other approach he mentions?
That one's called snowball sampling. It's super common in qualitative research.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
You start by talking to a few people, and then you ask them, hey, do you know anyone else who might be relevant to this study? And you interview those people.
I see. So you're building your sample through personal connections.
Right, like a snowball rolling and getting bigger.
I can see the appeal of that, but I also remember hearing it can be problematic, right? Like it leads to biased samples.
Yeah, that's the usual quantitative critique. Snowball samples are seen as more biased because the people you're interviewing all tend to know each other, so they might share similar views.
Right? Birds of a feather flock together, as they say.
Right. Exactly. But Small suggests that, well, if you're judging both cold calling, where tons of people don't respond, and snowball sampling, by these strict statistical rules, they both have bias problems. His point is that maybe bias isn't even the right way to think about this kind of in-depth exploratory work.
So if bias isn't the best way to think about this research, how should we think about it?
Small says the goal isn't to control for every little difference, but to really understand the people you're actually talking to understand those 35 cases in all their richness and complexity.
So it's about depth over breadth in a way.
Exactly. Small says this halfway solution, trying to make it representative with these small interview studies, it doesn't really work. He says researchers need to either fully commit to a different way of interpreting their findings or not aim for statistical representativeness at all. He even talks about thinking about participants not as a sample, but as a set of cases.
I like that. It shifts the focus away from the statistics.
Yeah. Okay, now, Small also looks at this other common scenario where ethnographers try to address generalizability, studying an average neighborhood.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that. It's like they're trying to find the most typical, the most normal place that'll represent all the others.
Right. He uses this hypothetical grad student Bill to show how this can go wrong.
Okay, what's Bill's research about?
Bill wants to figure out how poverty in a neighborhood affects out-of-wedlock births. So he decides to live in and study one high-poverty neighborhood for a while, really immerse himself.
Makes sense.
But he wants to be super rigorous, so he
Wow.
tries to pick a neighborhood that's like the most representative of the whole country.
Ambitious.
Right. He pores over census data, poverty rate, racial makeup, families.
Ah,
He even does these drive-bys, checking for litter, graffiti, all those things that fit his idea of a typical poor neighborhood. He gives it a generic name, says it's in some Midwestern city, and then jumps in. He might notice, for example, that people there don't trust each other much, which he then links to higher out-of-wedlock births. And because he picked this representative place, he figures this same pattern probably holds true everywhere.
Okay, but there are problems with this approach, right?
Oh, yeah, big time. Small points out a few.
Yeah.
First, no single neighborhood can ever truly represent all the others. There's just too much variation, too much history, too many local factors at play.
Right, every place is unique in its own way.
Exactly. And then Bill's confusing representative with average. Even if a neighborhood matches the average statistics of a bunch of others, studying it doesn't guarantee you'll get the same results as if you studied them all.
Ah, so you're saying there's a difference between statistical representativeness and simply matching some average characteristics.
Yes, exactly. A representative sample should give you similar results to studying the entire population, but one neighborhood just can't do that statistically.
Right, right.
And then there's Bill's own perception of what a poor neighborhood even looks like.
I can see where this is going.
Right. Small says it's probably influenced by, well, the media, movies, maybe even unconscious biases, things that might not reflect reality. So he might be picking a neighborhood based on a distorted image, not on what's truly representative.
So it's more about his perception than reality.
Exactly. And the bottom line is that studying one neighborhood is like having a sample of one. It just doesn't allow for generalization statistically, no matter how much detailed data Bill gathers. It's like saying, well, I know this one married 36-year-old woman with this specific income and education, so now I know everything about all women.
Okay, I get it. So like with the interview example, trying to find that one perfect representative case doesn't really work for ethnography if the goal is statistical generalizability. What does Small suggest researchers do instead?
He says instead of looking for the average, maybe go for the unique, the outlier. Studying those unusual situations can sometimes be way more insightful.
Can you give an example?
Say, instead of trying to find the statistically average poor neighborhood, Bill looks for one with a really unusual policy. Maybe they have some amazing program that helps single parents.
Okay.
Studying that unusual case could give him insights that he'd never get from a more typical place.
It's about using that uniqueness to your advantage.
Right. Small says these rare situations are often exactly what case study researchers should be looking for.
Okay. So where does Small go from there? He's pointed out the problem with these approaches that try to mimic quantitative research. What alternative does he offer?
He offers a few. And he starts by saying that we need to be open to different ways of thinking about knowledge and qualitative research. He outlines three main solutions for dealing with this whole generalizability question.
Okay, lay money.
The first one, which might seem a bit counterintuitive,
Uh-huh.
is to just kind of ignore the problem of statistical generalizability.
So just to say, forget about generalizing to everyone.
Well, he's not saying it's always the right move, but he says for some theoretical perspectives, it makes sense. Like if you're doing ethnomethodology, where you're super focused on how people make sense of their everyday lives in specific situations,
Right.
the idea that your findings should apply to completely different situations might not even matter to you.
Right. It's more about the how and why in that specific context.
Exactly. Same with narrative theories, where it's all about how people construct their identities through stories. It's not about generalizing that specific story to others, but about the logic behind it.
So basically he's saying pick your battles, right? Generalizability isn't the be-all and end-all for every kind of research.
Exactly. The second solution he talks about is to frame your work as hypothesis generating.
So you're basically saying, hey, this isn't meant to be a statistically representative study, but it gives us some cool ideas to test later on.
Exactly. You acknowledge upfront that your small study isn't going to tell us everything about everyone, but it can offer some interesting hypotheses that can be tested later with bigger, more quantitative methods.
Right.
But Small is careful to say that not all hypotheses are created equal. Just saying your work is hypothesis generating without thinking about the quality of those hypotheses, well, that's not a great solution either.
So you can't just slap that label on it and call it a day.
Right. And that brings us to his third solution, which is where he really gets into the meat of things.
Okay, tell me about this third option.
This is where Small says we need to think about qualitative research completely differently.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We need a new language, a new way of approaching inquiry, one that moves away from this obsession with statistics.
And what does that look like in practice?
He focuses on two big alternatives: the extended case method and what he calls sequential interviewing.
Okay, let's start with the extended case method.
Okay, so the extended case method, which is often associated with Michael Burroway, who builds on that Manchester school tradition in anthropology, guys like Max Gluckman, it involves a deep dive into a specific social situation, but the key is to always link that specific situation to the larger forces shaping it.
Okay.
He says it's different from the interpretive approach, which is more like Geats and the cockfights, where the idea is to see how that one case reveals something essential about society.
Right.
With the extended case method, it's more about seeing how these big societal forces play out on the ground in the specifics of the case.
So it's using the small to understand the big.
Right. But here's where it gets a bit tricky with Burroway's approach. On the one hand, he's clear that it's not just about generalizing from your one case study. It's about understanding that case in its full context.
Okay.
But on the other hand, he also says the real value of the single case study is what it tells us about society as a whole, not just a bunch of similar cases. He emphasizes societal significance over statistical significance.
I see. So it's less about statistically representing a population and more about using the deep dive into one case to illuminate the broader societal forces that shape our lives.
Right. And Small points out that Burroway loves these so-called deviant or unique cases because they can often shake up our theories.
That makes sense. If you want to challenge the status quo, sometimes you have to look at the exceptions, the things that don't fit the usual pattern.
Exactly. But Small also has this critique of Burroway's approach. He says it might only be a partial solution when it comes to making claims about other cases empirically, especially if you don't have a really well-defined theory of society to work with.
So, great for theory, but the link to other specific cases might be missing.
Right, and that's where he turns to Clyde Mitchell, who had a slightly earlier take on the extended case method.
Okay, how is Mitchell's approach different?
Mitchell is really focused on uncovering social processes through longitudinal studies. So you follow the same people over time as they go through different situations.
Oh, so it's about seeing how things unfold for specific individuals, not just a snapshot in time.
Exactly. He's really interested in the sequence of events and how they connect.
Interesting. And what does Mitchell say about whether the case needs to be typical or representative?
Well, he says asking that question totally misses the point of case studies. He says it confuses statistical inference, which is about drawing conclusions about a whole group from a sample, with studying this unique combination of things that make up a case.
So essentially he's saying don't even worry about whether a case is statistically typical.
Right. He says generalizability should be based on the logic of your analysis, not whether the events you studied are statistically typical. And Mitchell goes further, saying that case studies can't use statistical inference at all.
So how do you generalize that?
Well, he makes a distinction between statistical inference and something he calls logical inference.
Okay, what's that?
Statistical inference is when you draw conclusions about, say, a whole population based on a sample. Logical inference is when you draw conclusions about essential connections based on some explanatory model.
I see.
And he says case studies can only use logical inference.
Okay.
Mitchell uses this to show the difference between good and bad hypotheses from case studies. A bad hypothesis is just a description based on one case, with no logical reason to think it applies elsewhere.
Can you give an example?
Like seeing people openly using drugs in one poor neighborhood and then saying, well, that must happen in all poor neighborhoods. That would be a bad hypothesis, according to Mitchell.
Okay.
A good hypothesis is one that's more logical or causal based on the actual processes you see in your case.
Can you give me an example of a good hypothesis?
Small gives the example of seeing a strong link between how attached people are to their neighborhood and whether they'll get involved when there's crime. So from that one case, you might hypothesize that, in general, when a crime happens, how people react depends on how attached they are to their neighborhood. You can even frame it like, when X happens, whether Y will follow depends on W. X is the crime, Y is the reaction, and W is neighborhood attachment.
I see. So it's not about the specifics of that one neighborhood, but the underlying relationship you observe.
Exactly. And whether the case was typical or not doesn't even matter. The hypothesis comes from that logical inference from what's happening inside the case.
Got it.
And finally, Small adds that Mitchell's framework shows us the one type of empirical statement we can make from a single case. An ontological statement.
What's an ontological statement?
It's basically saying, hey, I discovered something that we didn't know existed before. It could be a new process, a new phenomenon, a new kind of relationship. And this is where qualitative research, especially ethnography, shines, finding and describing these new aspects of social life.
So it's less about generalizing and more about discovery.
Exactly.
This has been super helpful, but I'm curious about this second major alternative you mentioned earlier. What was it called again?
Sequential interviewing.
Right, right. Tell me more about that. It sounds like a very different way of approaching interview research.
It is. Small basically says we need to ditch this whole small sample mindset that's obsessed with representativeness and embrace a multiple case study logic, specifically for interviews.
Okay, I'm following.
He borrows this really useful distinction from Robert Yin, who talks about case study logic versus sampling logic.
Interesting. So what are the differences between those two?
Okay, so with sampling logic, which is what most surveys are based on, you start by figuring out how many people you need to interview to be statistically confident.
Right.
The whole goal is to be representative, to have a sample that perfectly reflects the larger group, usually by giving everyone an equal chance of being selected.
Oh.
And then everyone gets the same questionnaire, and the point is to say something about that whole big group.
Right. Standard survey stuff?
Exactly. But case study logic is different. You might not know how many interviews you need to do up front, and you're not trying to be representative in that statistical way.
Okay. How do you choose who to talk to then?
Well, you might start with a few people who fit your general criteria, but then you adjust as you go, choosing people who can either confirm what you're seeing or offer new perspectives. And your interview questions can even change from person to person as you learn more.
So it's way more flexible.
Right. And the goal is saturation. You keep going until new interviews don't really tell you anything new anymore.
I see. You keep digging deeper until you hit that point where you're not learning anything new.
Exactly. To illustrate this, Small talks about Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat, which we've discussed before.
Oh, yeah, with the standardized tests and all that.
Right. Steele didn't start with a big random group. He started with one really carefully designed experiment, and then he did a bunch more, each one building on the last. Some confirmed his earlier findings, some explored different angles.
Makes sense.
And through all those experiments, he was able to figure out this key psychological process, even though he never used random sampling to make broad claims about how common stereotype threat is.
So he's using this kind of case-building approach to figure out the underlying mechanisms.
Exactly. And Small suggests Jane could do something similar with her immigration study.
Okay, I'm curious. How would that work?
So instead of trying to get 35 perfectly representative people right away, she could start with just one in-depth interview.
Okay.
And then based on what she learns there, she picks the next person.
I see. So each interview informs the next.
Exactly. Maybe she looks for someone who will confirm her initial findings. Or maybe she looks for someone who might challenge her thinking a bit. And her questions change as she goes along, becoming more targeted. She keeps doing this until